Hello everyone and welcome back to another episode here of the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. My name is Christopher Shepard. Welcome to yet another show. Happy Tuesday to you all. And we should have another great show ahead for you today, starting off by recapping that game that took place last night. I know we still have to go over it, even though it was not the best of primetime games in Texas. Then we look to the waiver wire, though, and that could be a fun little thing. A lot of interesting players still out there potentially to pick up for your fantasy playoff push, or whether you want to bolster your team ahead of the fantasy playoffs to further cement your status as potential winner of your league. Then I'm going to be continuing my positional rankings for Week 12, my running backs and wide receivers. I'm concluding today's show with my fact versus fiction segment. Some claims that I came up with that either can be justified ahead of this week or should be debunked. But without further ado, before we get into today's show, I do want to remind you that if you want to view more content such as this or more exclusive short content on our YouTube channel, consider liking, following, and subscribing to the show in the network. But if you want to interact more directly throughout our shows, consider making yourselves available to the Super Chat, Super Thanks, and Super Stickers features here on YouTube. Great way to contribute and interact with the show. You can do three things. Go to our website, gsmcpodcast.net. Leave a tip or donation there. Or you can do it through YouTube by clicking that $ in your chat box in the comments section. Or if you don't feel like that, maybe you can just comment anything you want throughout the show. I will be glad to read your opinions on air as the show progresses. It just makes it that much better, more interesting, more interactive, gets you guys, our biggest supporters, involved, most importantly. But without further ado, let us jump into today's show. Starting off, of course, we have to recap last night's game. And it was not the best of games by any stretch of the imagination, but there were some positives here. Not necessarily a lot of them, but there were a lot of positives to take away, even for both teams. I know it's funny to say, considering the Cowboys looked pretty inept last night on both sides of the football, more so the offense. But I was still kind of intrigued by some things I saw that worked within the Dallas system. Not saying it will win them football games this year, but if they want to regroup and go about it next year and try and make a playoff push with a healthy Dak and a healthy CD, then there are some positive things that can take away from a game like this. And the Texans, on the other hand, we're glad that they got this kind of blowout win, but it wasn't necessarily the most convincing win that the Texans could have hoped for in this game. Because while, yes, if you're D'Amico Ryans, you're pleased with your defense, and we'll talk about them in this segment, you can't necessarily be pleased with the offensive struggles, especially in the second half of that football game, especially considering, that was something that people worried about with this team. How will CJ Stroud look later in games? Because it was clear that they came to set the tone early in the game, especially on that first drive when they had that first play from scrimmage touchdown taken back after that penalty, but then Joe Mixon runs it in from 45 yards out. So they were clear in their intent. They wanted to dominate this game, but it didn't necessarily carry over throughout the entirety of last night. So I want to focus on that. But other than that, from a fantasy standpoint, it was a very interesting game to kind of analyze. And when I think about it, looking at these stats, it wasn't the worst of fantasy performances from both offenses either. In fact, there were some pretty good ones. Let's start with the Texans because while, yes, I say that their offense did not move the football as effectively as one would want in a game like this, there was still a star player, and that star player was Joe Mixon. This guy is the reason why I think the Texans won't be overawed by certain teams when they get to the postseason, because they're going to have to play some very tough, physical, defensive fronts once they get to the playoffs, and chances are CJ Stroud might be overwhelmed early in those games as well. So Joe Mixon needs to continue setting the tone for this Texans offense, and if he does, then I would have way more hope and optimism for this team once they hit the postseason. 20 carries, 109 yards, 153 yards from scrimmage, 3 touchdowns, and 35.3 fantasy points. The clear star of the night, and the big difference in this game, because when I look at Dallas' sideline, potentially they could have made this game closer than it appeared had they had a competent running back or a competent running game to start with. Of course, I can't necessarily blame their offensive line, and was decimated by injuries in this game, but still, it clearly shows the talent discrepancies between these two teams. So Joe Mixon clearly won the night for the Texans. Then we look at C.J. Stroud. This is where it kind of gets a little disappointing. 23 of 39 passing, 257 yards, 1 interception, 10.88 fantasy points. And while it certainly wasn't his worst game by any stretch of the imagination, because he got the job done, he kept this offense mostly on schedule throughout the game, it wasn't a quote-unquote winning performance. Had this been a team like the Bills, like the Chiefs, like the Steelers, this performance would not have cut it. He got lucky against a Cowboys team that actually did kind of slow down this Texans offense at certain moments, and it could have been a much higher point total for the Texans had Stroud chipped in a couple of touchdowns. It wasn't necessarily to blame for most of the game, because I think that a lot of that was down to reincorporating Nico Collins into this lineup, trying to figure out, okay, how are we going to come up with different route concepts again, get back to that kind of structure, but still there's no excuses for not beating up on a team that's already dead this season. So that's why I can't necessarily erase this performance, especially from a fantasy perspective, from my mind, because now more doubters will heap on the pressure onto C.J. Stroud, and until he delivers, I might have to agree with them, because this has not been the sophomore season in the NFL that C.J. Stroud fans or Texans fans probably expected. And now we're starting to see that even in games of this nature, where you feel like he can have a big one, he kind of did not step up to the plate in this one, and so that leaves a little bit of concern. But another star for the Texans I have to give to the defense. This unit played fantastically. Yes, it was the Cowboys. Yes, it was Cooper Rush, but it was still an all-around dominant performance from this defensive front. Whether it be Nico Autry, Danielle Hunter, Will Anderson generating pressure, everyone in this Texans defensive front performed magnificently. 5 sacks, 1 touchdown, 1 interception, 1 fumble recovery, 17 fantasy points. And this is the unit that's clicking for D'Amico Ryans in his second year. The offense might be a little bit shaky right now, but the defense is going to take this football team far, because they're right there in the AFC hierarchy when it comes to defenses. I would go, the Steelers are probably the best defense in the AFC, but then they're right there with the Bills, maybe even better than the Bills in terms of talent on paper. Yes, this was an offense that definitely would not have tested them, but I still feel like they're proving that they've steadily improved from where they were at the start of the D'Amico Ryans era to now. And in the playoffs, who knows what will happen to them, but this is a solid foundational performance to go by. Now, let's talk about the Cowboys side of things. And it's certainly not the prettiest, and I think that those pieces of metal falling from the ceiling of AT&T were a pretty apt description of the Cowboys right now. The sky is completely falling on them. They're collapsing mid-season. But there were a couple things that led me to believe that if a couple things went their way, this game would have been closer, or at least the score would have been more favorable towards them. Cooper Rush, yeah, he played pretty averagely, and he could have had way more interceptions than just the one, but he wasn't necessarily hindering this team. He wasn't hurting this team. And, CeeDee Lamb, he contributed as well, but he wasn't necessarily the focal point. What I really actually liked of this Cowboys performance was that we saw a lot of different weapons for them. We saw Devontae Turpin get a great touchdown. We saw players Braden Spanford, their rookie tight end, step up and get some targets. Flournoy. We saw a lot of different options for this Cowboys team try and step up and fill that void. So, while it definitely is a demoralizing defeat and leaves them in a very dark place for this season, at least we got to see some players who could contribute to this team's growth. Let's focus on two players in particular, Cooper Rush and CeeDee Lamb here, because they should be the focal points of at least this fantasy discussion. Cooper Rush had 32 pass completions out of 55, 354 yards, 1 touchdown, 1 interception. Actually beat Stroud in terms of fantasy production with 16.36 fantasy points. So that's one small moral victory, at least for the Dallas Cowboys there. Then CeeDee Lamb, 8 receptions, 93 yards, 18.6 fantasy points. I would have to say this has been one of his more disappointing performances, right? Because while, yes, I am gladdened to see all these different players for the Cowboys step up, you're CeeDee Lamb. You have to do better for your team, and I know it's kind of rough and frustrating right now, but you need to be the leader. Granted, this is not something I thought it would be saying, considering how that was what I believe the problem would be for the Cowboys in the first place, trying to ease the tension that Dak and CeeDee might bring into the building with their contracts now complete. But he is still a vocal presence right now in this locker room, and he needs to be a glue guy, right, that connects this team together while Dak is on the sidelines for the time being. So I must say that this overall was a springboard for what could be a much improved Cowboys team next year. Because what I saw was that at least this organization is willing to put certain pieces out in the field to try different things and not just pack it in. And that's what really stood out to me in this very tough loss for the Cowboys. So yes, they might just be one of, if not the worst teams in the NFL right now. But what I saw last night gave me hope and optimism for their season next year. But ultimately, decent win for the Texans. Not the most convincing, but it just goes to show that this league is tough. And some teams may have more heart than we think. The Cowboys certainly tried to prove that last night. To no avail, but they certainly proved that they're not going to be a lightweight in 2025, perhaps. Let me know what you think about this game in the comments. It was definitely an interesting one to talk about from a fantasy perspective. But coming up next, we transition to looking at the waiver wire. Some hidden gems still out there for your fantasy playoff push or to truly bolster your squad to make it even more of a juggernaut. We'll be right back after this short break to talk about that.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign.
I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits. I'm losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in...
Hello everyone and welcome back into the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. Before we get into our second segment of the day here on the show, I do want to remind you yet again that if you feel so inclined throughout the show to want to interact directly with me, through leaving some comments, questions or concerns, or tips or donations, what have you. Consider making yourselves available to the Super Chat, Super Thanks, or Super Stickers features on YouTube. Even our website is a great place to leave a tip or donation, if you so choose, through GSMCpodcast.net. But any way you decide to interact with the show is greatly appreciated and just makes this show that much better. But without further ado, let us jump into that second segment of the day, and let's discuss the waiver wire. We are quickly winding down the fantasy football season here. I know we still have, it seems like a lot of weeks left, but they're quickly shortening by the week and the months and eventually the end of the year. So this waiver wire is definitely going to look a bit crazier than we think, especially considering, how certain fantasy football managers might view their teams at this point, whether or not they're packing it in, whether or not they still think they can make the playoffs, whether or not they're sitting pretty at the top and they just want to bolster their squad. So these are all players who can do that for you in whatever capacity you need. But I do think that there's something to be said about certain waiver wire pickups and their teams and where they are in the season that could affect your decisions on the waiver wire. For example, a lot of these players are on teams that are either in contention or trying to make that playoff push. Some might be considered out of it, as well. But still, it's definitely something to consider when you're looking for players that you want to bolster you. Do you think that they're going to play out the season and not give it their all? Or do you actually think that because their teams are in awkward situations, that they will continue to perform at this standard? So without further ado, let's talk about these players. And let's talk about one that's pretty polarizing. Taysom Hill, and what his importance can mean both for the Saints playoff push and for your fantasy football playoff push. Because he is a very weird, confounding player, especially in a fantasy context. Because I don't necessarily know if this Saints team is really looking towards the playoffs, or, if they're simply utilizing Taysom Hill to potentially give this team a little bit more spark. Because it seems like they're in a weird situation, right? They fired Dennis Allen. Darren Rizzi's the interim. Has won 2 games so far. And suddenly, there's hype around the Saints again. But is this hype real, or is it just a factor of this interim head coach bringing this different light to this team? And so where Taysom Hill falls into that equation, I don't know. But when he plays, you always have to think that he's going to be the focal point of what the Saints do. They're going to try to get him as many touches as possible, and they're going to try and factor him into their game plans. Whether or not that equates to their own success on the field doesn't necessarily matter, but from a fantasy context, you can take advantage of what the Saints might be thinking right now. Because either way, whether they're not going to make this playoff push or they are, they're going to want to try and utilize certain weapons to the best of their abilities and see what they have, because they are also one of the teams that has the worst cap situation, so they're going to want to try and figure things out as well to see who sticks around. So Taysom Hill is certainly going to be a figure to monitor, potentially not a pickup right away, but give it a couple weeks, and then maybe once the fantasy playoffs hit and you need someone as a last second addition, then he could be sitting pretty there for you. Then let's talk about 2 guys we also discussed on yesterday's show. Jonnu Smith for the Miami Dolphins and Nick Westbrook-Ikhine for the Tennessee Titans. 2 players in very weird situations. Nick Westbrook-Ikhine, of course, on a Titans team that's not expected to make the playoffs anymore. But still, is a very intriguing one in that Will Levis does have that big arm of his, and they did connect for a 98-yard touchdown, and he has played very well. I believe he scored 12-plus fantasy points in all 3 of their past contests. So that's something of note when you're considering these lower-tier teams for your waiver wire additions. Because when you think about these guys, have to think about them in the context of their situation, right? That's paramount when you're looking at the waiver wire. And Nicholas Bukakine is in a situation where the Titans aren't going anywhere, but he has this quarterback who can take advantage of his verticality. And so that's why I think Nicholas Bukakine could be effective, maybe not for your fantasy football playoffs proper, but for that push, right? Say if you're in the middle of the pack and you want to ensure that you make it into the playoffs in these last couple of games, then Nicholas Bukakine could be of more value to you than someone on a contending NFL team. So look for Nicholas Bukakine to be one of those volatile players who is either going to be on rosters late into the fantasy playoffs or kind of on those fantasy rosters that want to make that final push, and then eventually he might have to be dropped. And then Jonnu Smith's one of those guys where he could actually be for real on a team that could be very dangerous down the stretch. The Miami Dolphins are definitely backs the wall situation-wise, but they are a team that still has the offensive firepower to achieve big things. And Jonnu Smith has certainly been one of the surprising factors in this rise for them. And so, looking at how, he might have to fit in for the rest of the season, a lot of people might be a little bit apprehensive to pick him up, but I think this is no fluke. This is a guy in Jonnu Smith who I truly believe can be a fantasy factor and a real-life factor for the Miami Dolphins. So, these are two players, right, in very weird situations. One whose team might want to push for the playoff, one whose team is definitely out of it. But both could be very effective in terms of whatever strategy you want to employ from a fantasy perspective. So that's why I had to include them as well. Then another guy at a running back position on a contending team who has essentially seen his touches kind of skyrocket in the past couple of weeks and might play a lot more for this Minnesota Vikings team as Aaron Jones kind of recovers from his rib injury. Cam Akers could definitely be an interesting play, especially if you're someone who wants to bolster your squad for the fantasy football playoffs in preparation for it. So Cam Akers, while he's certainly not, the most effective in fantasy production, I think that at least his touches will skyrocket and his opportunities will arise in these coming weeks should the Vikings want to rest up Aaron Jones. So that's why I think he as well is very interesting too. And then in terms of other running backs, I feel like, Roschon Johnson's going to be a name that comes up a lot. But that's highly dependent on how new OC Thomas Brown views the Bears as a running team. Because when I think about what Thomas Brown might want to do for the Bears moving forward, considering the fact that they technically still are in playoff contention, is just establish a foundation for which Caleb Williams can grow and mature. And we saw in that Packers game was indicative of a Caleb Williams that still has a long way to go, but is willing for change. And we saw mature choices from him in that game, but I still feel like, then again, that running game can really help to bolster this squad as well. Because I like what they can do with DeAndre Swift and Roschon Johnson and that running back room as a whole. They just have to trust it. And I think that Thomas Brown is going to be smart enough to implement different looks for these running backs to A, get them better looks and touches, and B, to better help Caleb Williams develop and grow, because you need a strong backfield as a rookie quarterback that you can rely upon in moments like these. So that's why I feel like, even though DeAndre Swift I feel like is only going to get better from a fantasy perspective as weeks go on, Roschon Johnson could certainly be someone that can be effective. In terms of the quarterback position, this is where it gets a little bit interesting. We're going to mention some names at the end of the show in my Fact versus Fiction segment, and they might shock a lot of people. But I want to make a pick now that I feel like is more of a safe ground. How about Anthony Richardson? I know it's kind of wild considering this is a guy who hasn't played many NFL games. This team, this Colts organization hasn't really, seen enough of him to prove that he can lead this team in real life, let alone as a fantasy football manager prove to you all that he can be a solid fantasy player, but he certainly brings a level of hype to this Colts offense, and he brings a reinvigorated energy as well, because while he's definitely erratic, he does present more of a big play threat than a guy like Joe Flacco right now. And it's crazy to say considering what Flacco did with the Browns, but this is a different situation. These Indianapolis Colts feel like they're right in the precipice of being a true playoff contender. And so, while Joe Flacco had that nice run with the Browns, Anthony Richardson, A, needs this in order to develop and mature as an NFL player himself, and B, to actually give some hope and optimism to this Colts squad. And while it sounds funny considering his actions, it still is the best option in my opinion for the Colts going forward, because there's no way that Anthony Richardson sitting on the bench can mean anything to this Colts squad. Even if he loses 11 games or wins 11 games in these next couple of years, this is a guy who I completely think should get an opportunity to prove himself. Maybe as a fantasy football manager to prove himself to you as well. Let me know what you think in the comments about that. Coming up next, we continue my positional rankings with my running backs. I really think that this position's starting to round into another, yet again, very volatile position from a fantasy perspective. So we'll be right back after the break to try and figure this position out.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free. Just search.
Hello everyone and welcome back into this GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. And for our third segment of the day, we continue with our positional rankings ahead of Week 12 with our running backs. Now, like I said before the break, this position has certainly become a lot more volatile than people might have expected before the season. Everyone thought that there were going to be a handful of running backs who were truly going to be special from a fantasy standpoint. But then, one of them, particularly that number one overall pick for several people, did not play for most of the season, and all these mid-tier running backs either got injured or underperformed or in some cases overperformed. And this is where we stand in very pivotal weeks for the running back position from a fantasy perspective, because I feel like the running back position is kind of teamless. And what I mean by that is that whether or not they're on a contending team or a team just wanting to get the season over with, the running back position is still one of a lot of value. And so I feel like this is going to be a week where anything can happen from a running back perspective in fantasy. So without further ado, let's jump right into it. Starting off with Chuba Hubbard. Interesting running back, especially considering the fact that this is a Panthers team that got a bye at a very weird time after a 2-game win streak, albeit flying to Germany for that second game, and might want to rest up a little bit after that long flight. But still, the Chiefs coming off their first loss this season, and a lot of people might be very apprehensive about this. But I really think that Chuba Hubbard has proven himself in this Panthers system, and even when Jonathan Brooks comes back, this is a guy who the Panthers can't let go. I feel like, the Chiefs are a very physical run defense, but the way to attack them is to go through your run game. And I feel like the way that this team has incorporated Bryce Young back into this offense is through the run game. Bryce Young has relied upon Chuba Hubbard, and thus that's relaxed him as well. So this may not be a Panthers win, and it may not be a pretty game for them. But I still think that the best way for them to move this ball against the Chiefs is through the running game, and I feel like Bryce Young and Chuba Hubbard have developed a rapport enough to convince me that perhaps Chuba Hubbard could be a surprising play from a fantasy perspective. Perhaps in a deeper league, because chances are if you're in a standard league, you might not want to take that risk, but still, I think this is an interesting matchup for him that I can do pretty well against. And I'm not saying that it's a winning situation for him, but it's a situation that I can't ignore because Chuba Hubbard has been that special for the Panthers over these past couple of weeks. So look for him to potentially surprise from a fantasy perspective against a very tough Chiefs run defense. Then, my second pick here had a big game last night and might have to do it again in another potential trap game for this Texans team. Joe Mixon, the fantasy running back of the week probably. 35.3 fantasy points, like I said, against that Dallas Cowboys team. And I feel like, for what it's worth, he's going to have to do it again. Like I said, these are matchups that seem tougher on paper than they do perhaps on the field, because a lot of people might be thinking, well, these defenses might, either rat these running backs up or actually dominate them. But this one is a weird matchup, right? Because I feel like the Titans are an under-respected defense, especially against the run. And they have a lot of depth up front that I feel could challenge this team, most importantly, challenge C.J. Stroud. And what C.J. Stroud can rely upon now is a guy like Joe Mixon. So look for this team to alleviate some of the pressure on C.J. Stroud by getting Joe Mixon the football. And I think he can produce, because what he showed against Dallas was that in these kinds of games, he's a very valuable player. I would love to see it against a more playoff-worthy team when they'll get their chances down the stretch. But for now, in these very tough, quote-unquote, trap game-like matchups, a guy like Joe Mixon can be very successful, because I think a lot of these lower-level teams, these lower-tier teams, want to key in on the run against some of these high-powered offenses. And so I think Joe Mixon can really attack that in the Titans and really make them reconsider their game plan. Because it's one thing to try and stop a guy like C.J. Stroud, even though he's not had a particularly good season. He's still an elite quarterback. But it's quite another thing to stop a tandem in Stroud and Mixon. So Mixon's going to make this very challenging for a Titans defense that want to draw them in this game. So look for this matchup to be very intriguing for a lot of fantasy football managers. And I really think, I'm still waiting for the Texans to say that they can win a game without relying on Joe Mixon too heavily. But until that day, he's the most important player from here on out in this Texans offense. Not Nico Collins, not T.J. Stroud, Joe Mixon. Because he's the only player who I think can really, truly carry this team to victory. Especially come playoff time, because they're going to have a tough run of it in the playoffs. They're going to face a lot of physical teams, and they're going to have to rise to the occasion. But Joe Mixon, I know I can rely upon above all else to really step up. So look for him to continue doing it, especially in games like this, like I said. Then, the third guy I want to mention, a guy who I kind of feel like has lost a little bit of his luster. This running back room in particular has lost a little bit of its luster over the past couple of weeks, playing two very tough games. But I think that this is a get-right game for this team and this guy in particular, just because I feel like the run game for this Commanders offense is going to become a point of contention and a point of discussion for this Washington Commanders team once they reach the postseason. Because I feel like, this can be a situation where the Commanders, much like what Texans did last year with Stroud, can win a playoff game or two. But they're going to have to rely a little bit more on the run game, starting with this week against the Cowboys, and particularly with Mr. Austin Eckler. He had a solid game against the Philadelphia Eagles, 17.6 fantasy points. But when I look at this Washington team, and I look at it from this perspective of trying to find different ways for their offense to operate, I feel like in order for Jaden Daniels to not have so much pressure on him, this running back room needs to get back to what it does best, and that is have different kind of opportunities for each of these three running backs to really come into their own. I feel like the way they can do that with Austin Eckler is get him more involved in the receiving game, get him more involved in short yard situations, and utilize the other two running backs in J.M. McNichols and Brian Robinson Jr. in more physical situations. Because, Austin Eckler can be this kind of skeleton key, this secret weapon for this Washington Commanders offense come playoff time. He's a very experienced, intelligent player, but also someone who I feel like, Jaden Daniels really connects with in this running back group in terms of what he wants to do himself. So look for Jaden Daniels to continually rely upon Austin Eckler in the weeks to come, and then once they get to the postseason, to also heavily lean on him as well. Because this is still a team capable, like I said, of winning a playoff game or two. Maybe not making it all the way to the NFC Championship game, but they're definitely capable of winning a playoff game or two. They just have to rely on the run game, especially with this guy, Austin Eckler. And ultimately, I think they should be fine. And it's a Cowboys team that, yes, I still think has a lot of good defensive pieces that could be able to slow down this Washington running attack. But still, inept enough for me to say that Austin Eckler will move the ball effectively on them. Because this should be an easy matchup for him, and a matchup that could get this Washington Commanders running game back to what it can be. So that's why I feel like Austin Eckler this week can be interesting. The last one I want to talk about, another kind of weird one, but I think in this game that I'm really thinking highly of from a fantasy standpoint, in the NFC West, this guy can finally have a breakthrough game. Because I feel like this is the game where a lot of pressure is going to be taken off the Seattle O-line, and thus a guy like Kenneth Walker can operate. He had an average game against the San Francisco 49ers, 13.4 fantasy points, but this was against the Cardinals. Just feels like a week where both teams are going to focus on opening up their offenses through the run game. Maybe this will come back to bite me because Seattle, out of both of these teams, has not had that much success when it comes to the run game, whereas the Cardinals do. And so I could have reversed this to say that James Conner would have a big game, and I think that he will as well. But the reason why I feel like this is Kenneth Walker's opportunity is because looking at the Seattle team, there are different ways they can run the football where I feel like they can get Kenneth Walker in space where he's most effective. They don't necessarily have to put too much pressure on their guards. They feel like they can hone in on one area along their offensive line that can be effective enough to hold up in run protection and run blocking. Then I feel like Kenneth Walker can get more opportunities, especially as a receiver as well, because he can also be effective in that regard. So look for him to be very versatile in this game. I feel like Seattle might also want to rely on extra tight ends to block, but who knows? Because this is going to be a very weird divisional game. But I still think Kenneth Walker holds merit in this matchup here, because this is a game for Seattle where all bets are off for how they look. They have to come out, though, with an offensive game plan that utilizes all of the weapons, and that includes Kenneth Walker. So that's why I feel like, in this game where any player from either team could be a fantasy star, perhaps one of the more least likely to do it steps up in the situation. And it's a huge burden on the offensive line for Seattle. It's asking a lot to say that Kenneth Walker can be effective in this one. But it's still something that I feel can happen just because I know how good Kenneth Walker can be in different opportunities. But just looking at this list again, these are all guys who perhaps we may have expected to see on a lot of lists for starts this week. But I just want to give some variation. They're not even, matchups in which I feel a lot of them would be favored in. But I still like this collection of players just because of what I know they can do for their offenses. I know what they're capable of, regardless of what their record says about them as well. And that's an important factor. Let me know what you think about this list in the comments, because coming next we continue with this positional rankings theme here with my wide receivers, another versatile position. We'll be right back after this short break.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere.
Hello everyone and welcome back into the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. And for our fourth segment of the day here on the show, we are going to be continuing with our positional rankings with our wide receiver positions this time. Another position, very volatile and versatile this season. But all of these players, right, are either in situations where they have to step up for their teams, and I feel like based off their matchups they definitely can, or, have just risen the fantasy wide receiver ranks for me, in my personal opinion, and how I view them at this current moment in time. So without further ado, let's jump right into this segment here, because I think it's going to be very interesting and telling for where we're at in terms of the wide receiver landscape in fantasy. Let's start off with a guy who is of the step it up variety, Tyreek Hill, going up against the Patriots. He had 19.1 fantasy points this week against the Las Vegas Raiders, but I kind of feel like I'm still waiting for him to really continue to be what the Dolphins need him to be as a vocal leader and as a leader on the field, especially for this team. Because I feel like this stretch for the Dolphins has been very positive, but in a much different way, we'll think. For example, 2 weeks ago against the Rams, they focused on the defensive side of the football, getting them the win. But this week, on the offensive side of the football, they focused on guys who really hadn't been getting a lot of opportunities. Devon Achane, for example, looked like much more of himself, or last year's self, than he has all season long. And Jonnu Smith, we talked about, is an interesting weapon to utilize in these last couple of weeks as well. But the reason why I think Tyreek Hill is going to do well is because it's not just a matchups thing. It's because it's what he's going to do as the season progresses and as the Dolphins grow more confident. Because this Dolphins team really believes in itself, and they're not necessarily in the worst position in the AFC. Everything's in front of them. Yes, they have tough matchups ahead, but I feel like they're at a place where, because of Tua's return, any avenue for them is open yet again. So look for Tyreek Hill to prove that in these coming games, especially against an opponent like the Pats, where, they want to finish them off. This is a divisional game still, and they want to finish them off no matter how bad the Pats look. So look for Tyreek Hill, not just in this game, perhaps over the next couple of weeks as well, as the Dolphins try to make that playoff push, really elevate his game for this team. Then let's talk about another Seattle Seahawk here, who kind of has taken a little bit of a backseat His first game back from an injury after the bye against San Fran, 14 points there. DK Metcalf in this game against the Cardinals. A lot of people might say, well, this could be an opportunity for me to mention a guy like JSN, really lighting it up from a fantasy perspective. But I think that the reason why I think so highly of not just this game, but DK Metcalf within this game, in the context of this game, is because not just of the matchup, because of the physicality he presents and the way he can open up the rest of the field for the Seahawks. While I'm not going to mention either Ty Lockett or JSN, I'm going to mention that because of what DK Metcalf's going to bring to this game, they also can see their numbers elevate and production elevate as a result. So look for DK Metcalf to be an important receiver in many different ways for Seattle in this game. He's a matchup nightmare. I feel like Geno loves him in certain situations, whether it's 3rd and long or they want to take a shot to the end zone near midfield. They love utilizing DK Metcalf in so many different ways. He's a reliable physical target. And I feel like the Cardinals are going to be hard done by to compensate for that because they have to worry about Tyler Lockett savvy as well. JSN's truly been one of the better route runners in the league over the past couple of weeks, especially considering the fact that, they've needed him to be that guy, or with DK being absent for quite some time. But this is the game where DK Metcalf proves his worth, the Seattle Seahawks, and most importantly, to their playoff push as well, because this is a very pivotal game. The winner, either whether it be the Cardinals, remains in first place in the NFC West, or Seahawks, they ultimately get elevated into first place. But I still think that DK Metcalf is going to shine in this one, no matter what befalls the Seahawks, because of the fact that his matchup physicality is just something that's so hard to compensate for NFL defenses. Then the third guy I want to talk about, now we're going to get into two guys who are kind of in that camp of these guys have snuck up on people in fantasy. This guy I really think very highly of, especially this season, and what he's been able to do for this Chargers team. And while they aren't a pass-first offense anymore with Jim Harbaugh at the helm, this guy has proven that when, they can develop a passing game and get that going, he really is effective down the field. And that's Quentin Johnson. This is going to be a very exciting matchup. We're going to learn a lot about this Chargers team against the Ravens next Monday night. And I feel like Quentin Johnson's going to be a big part of that because his task is going to be easier than done than said because of that Ravens secondary. I feel like Jim Harbaugh's loving these opportunities to go up against these defenses that do not have good secondaries because, they have good offenses, but, it gives this Chargers offense opportunity to kind of quote-unquote sneak up on people because that's what I feel like what happened to the Cincinnati Bengals. They thought, that the Chargers would run a lot more, but Justin Herbert came out passing. And if he does it again against the Ravens, especially against that very weak secondary, then chances are Quentin Johnston will get a lot of yards really quickly. So I really like this matchup for him, but don't let all these matchups against weaker defenses fool you. I still think that against premier competition, Quentin Johnston's going to be a viable fantasy asset. Because I look at this Chargers team, I feel like, Jim Harbaugh has found the perfect balance for it. This isn't like the Michigan team where he rarely let J.J. McCarthy pass them to victory. This is a team where he knows Justin Herbert is an elite NFL quarterback and trusts him wholeheartedly when he needs him. And so that balance, that trust, is really making this Chargers team special. And once they trust themselves, especially if they even get to the postseason, which we have to see down the stretch. But if they get to the postseason, this team is not going to be a fluke. I initially thought that was going to be the case, but this team is not going to be a fluke. And I feel that it's all down to this offense and its variety. And Quentin Johnston's role in it as well. So I really think very highly of him. And I think in this matchup, he's going to continue to prove his worth for this Chargers team. 12.8 fantasy points for Cincinnati. Definitely not his best game, but I just know that he's in for several more solid fantasy performances this season. And then last but not least, let's talk about a weird situation here. for a wide receiver because I didn't necessarily want to mention his stat line, but I thought it was going to be interesting. How about Michael Williams for the Pittsburgh Steelers? When I looked at this matchup and I looked at his stats at the end of the game, I was shocked to see that a healthy Michael Williams had 0 fantasy points. And, it was the slog of a game, that game between the Steelers and the Ravens. But, you expect better out of a guy like Michael Williams, who's such a vertical threat down the field, the former Charger. But going up against the Browns, who definitely still feel very prideful in their situation right now. They're playing with a lot of heart. And you would think that the secondary is the best part of this team. I think that Michael Williams is their biggest test. And, it's come back to hurt me because, this Pittsburgh offense has not really looked very lively yet. I feel like, Russell Wilson can still be effective, but that game against the Ravens didn't necessarily convince me or impress me that much outside of what they did defensively and, Chris Boswell being solid kicking those field goals. But Michael Williams is certainly someone they didn't just bring in to not have immediate effect because he can. And against the Browns in what could be a feisty divisional game and what could project to be a much more difficult game than the Pittsburgh Steelers think, Michael Williams could be the difference maker. And I feel like Russell Wilson, once he gets comfortable with him, will rely on him as someone who brings out the best in himself. And so look for that deep ball connection to hit a couple of times in this game because I think that, the Browns secondary isn't as potent as it was last year. It's not a secondary that can generate takeaways, not a secondary that's as sticky in coverage as last year's. It's still the same players, but they're playing a little bit differently or playing a little bit more tensely. And so that's why I feel like this is an opportunity for Mike Williams to make his stamp with this Pittsburgh Steelers team. So all 4 of these guys, look out for them this week. Definitely a lot of interesting storylines here, but let me know what you think of the comments before our last segment of the day. A fun one to conclude. Fantasy fact versus fiction. Which bold fantasy claims that I made for this week can be easily justified or just as easily debunked? You definitely don't want to miss this segment to close out the show, so we'll be right back after this short break. Hello everyone and welcome back into the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. And for our final segment of the day here on today's show, we're doing a fun little segment that I like to call my Fantasy Fact versus Fiction segment ahead of Week 12 of the NFL season. This is one of my favorite segments, newer one that gives me opportunities to present some bold fantasy claims to you guys and justify them or debunk them. And a couple of these are a little bit far-fetched, I must say. But I feel like this group of takes that I came up with this week definitely are very viable. Without further ado, let's jump right into it. Starting off with, yet again, some Seahawks-Cardinals talk. Let's talk about DK Metcalf yet again as well. Potentially being the wide receiver 1 amongst fantasy wide receivers this week, and I definitely think this is fact. I definitely think that DK Metcalf is going to play a huge role and have a huge impact in this game. And I feel like, Geno has been trying to distribute the wealth in this offense, and it's been to good effect. JSN's definitely had a couple good weeks so far. Tyler Lockett's still someone who I think can get the job done. Is a very reliable pair of hands in that system. And, even some guys like A.J. Barner and Noah Fant are still effective. But when all is said and done, in a very important game, look for Geno to trust DK Metcalf, his number one receiver in this offense the most. Because chances are the Cardinals want to turn this into a shootout. I feel like, they think that they can take advantage of some of the offensive ineptitudes that have faced Seattle over the past couple of weeks. And they feel that their offense is capable of putting up 30 to 35 points in this game. But I feel like in order for the Seahawks to match that, they're going to come out as they've always come out, willing to pass the football. And all Geno has to do is be smart with the football and get it to DK, and I think that'll be pretty effective. And it's not an indictment of the Seattle receiver corps by any means to say that JSN and Tyler Lockett won't be factors, but DK is going to be the biggest because of his physicality, because of what he means in this matchup for a guy like Geno who needs a receiver to step up. So look for DK to take advantage of that and potentially have a very big fantasy performance, potentially a career-defining fantasy performance in this matchup for Seattle. So I definitely think that this one lies in the fact camp. Then my second one that I'm going to come up with, a little bit of a weirder one, but the Titans defense potentially being one of the more surprising ones of the week. And while I definitely hyped them up a little bit in this game against the Texans, I'm definitely going to say this is fiction. I feel like, CJ Stroud is someone who, yes, can struggle against defenses of this kind of magnitude, of this kind of nature, that sucks him into their game. But I feel like this is the opportunity for this Texans offense to relax a little bit. They're not going to necessarily feel too overwhelmed by this Titans team. And so I feel like this is the get-right game for the Texans. Not saying that this Cowboys game wasn't, but they need to paper over some cracks and fix some flaws. So this game could be one of those games where we see the Texans wanting to deliver a statement of intent. And it could look pretty ugly for the Titans. I feel like this could come back to bite me just because, I really think if the Titans can slow down Joe Mixon, that's one way to take away a big part of the Texans' offense. But I feel like the second week of Nico Collins being in this offense is going to be pivotal. And I feel like he's going to get going in this one as well. So that's half the battle, the Titans' defense, but not the whole battle. Because you have to find a way to stop Nico Collins. And if you can't, it could turn into a pretty ugly game for you yet again. So I feel like this one is going to have to fall strictly into the fiction camp for me. But this is the one where I feel like I could be proven most wrong. Just because I'm really, really high on a defense like this. Now, I said the same thing a little bit about the Colts, and they have an even tougher matchup against the Lions. So hopefully, one of these defenses shocks me this weekend, whether it be the Colts or the Titans. But this definitely feels like one that I could definitely see becoming a fact by the end of Sunday's slate of games, just because I think that highly of the Titans defense. Then the third one I want to talk about. This one's a little bit of a weird one too, but given the context of both of these teams, right? Not just considering one of them, it can be justified that this could be a bold fantasy claim. How about the Broncos and Raiders potentially being a fantasy snooze fest? I feel like, this Raiders team is certainly the team that is definitely the reason why this game gets dragged down in terms of significance and magnitude. And the Broncos are definitely carrying the burden in terms of fantasy production in this one. But I'm going to say fiction for both of these sides, actually. Because I feel like, this Raiders team also had an OC change. And they did what I always wanted them to do, and that's get Brock Bowers more involved. And so Brock Bowers, once he's involved, he's a very exciting fantasy prospect. A lot of fantasy football managers have been waiting for him to have a game much like he did against Miami, and this week I think he can replicate it. It's a tough physical defense that he's facing, but I feel like if they focus on getting him the ball in short to intermediate areas of the field, they definitely can get going here. As the Broncos, we already know that this team's very appealing from a fantasy perspective. But I think the weirdness about it, that potentially could lean more towards the fact camp, is that because of the many different ways Bo Nix distributes the football to different players, it could get a little bit muddy in who to pick. Because Sutton, has been a major part of this offense for many years now, but hasn't necessarily been the focal point of this offense. Mims, has started to come into his own. Javonte Williams is still a viable fantasy option on the ground. So there's so many different weapons that it could be tough to choose who really stands out in a game like this, where they should dominate on the offensive side of the football, but it just makes it that much more fun. I'm really starting to love the Broncos. I feel like, if my Hawks don't make the playoffs and the Broncos do, this is a team I can easily get behind for that playoff run, because they're just playing this fast, loose brand of football. Bo Nix is really buying into the Sean Payton philosophy right now, and they just look like a team that can cause some noise late in the season. So, while, the Raiders side of things could drag this game down, I wouldn't necessarily go so far as to say it's a game that would make you fall asleep. So that's why I'm leaning a little bit more towards fiction than fact here. But the reason why I'm still a little bit skeptical about switching it is because A, of the variety of the Broncos offense and the fact that not one player perhaps could be a fantasy star for you, and B, the fact that Brock Bowers may just be the only fantasy star for the Las Vegas Raiders at this point. But it should be an interesting game that a lot of people might not expect to be any good, but could surprise a lot of people. Much like the Broncos-Falcons game surprised a lot of people, but not in the way I expected. I actually predicted that game to be, a little bit more exciting than it was. But this game certainly feels like, at least from a fantasy standpoint, can deliver a lot of success for you from that perspective. And the last one, definitely perhaps the topic of the week here, and from a fantasy perspective, could be a little bit more contentious than you think. Either Drew Lock, who we now know isn't in this conversation, or Tommy DeVito, who we now know is in this conversation, are fantasy sleepers if they give playing time. And we now all know that that's going to be a fact. What we don't know is how Tommy DeVito will look after the benched Daniel Jones. So that's the kind of question here. And I'm going to say fact just because I feel like this Giants team is ready to turn the page. Whether it be, completely getting rid of Daniel Jones, whether it's, having a short leash with Dable potentially in the future, or whether, it's just giving Tommy DeVito an opportunity to prove himself, potentially. Maybe not in the future for the New York Giants, but for a team that could be looking for backup help. But it's definitely an interesting situation in which I feel like there's a lot of leverage either way. Either Tommy DeVito doesn't give you what you want, and you're stuck in draft purgatory, or this is a situation where you're kind of bridging the gap between a potential kind of get right period for Daniel Jones, or to the draft where you feel like you can take a much better quarterback option. So I feel like, in terms of a fantasy perspective, it is kind of weird to consider Tommy DeVito as a fantasy sleeper just because of the nature of how he was given the position and the state of the Giants offense. But I feel like there's merit to this decision for the Giants because, for one, a lot of people are saying that he could be someone that could be a detriment to the Giants' season, but the way I look at it, I think this is a decision for the Giants that puts them in a headspace of at least knowing that for the rest of the season, they can be reliant on some sort of competency at quarterback. As Sheppy Sweetball says, Tommy Cutlet's saucy starter. I indeed agree. I feel like he at least brings, a certain moxie. This Giants offense that might have been missing with Daniel Jones. And I'm not necessarily certain as to what this says about the future of the New York Giants organization, but it's certainly a decision that gives the season much more intent than expected. As Daniel Jones destined to back up for the next few years to somebody's sweet spot, I feel like that could be a play for the Giants as well. Just because, I'm not willing to completely say that Daniel Jones as a quarterback was going to be out of the league by next year, but I feel like, he is kind of one of those trusty dusty backups, so to speak, who could step in effectively for someone in the future. But for now, this is the situation. This is where the Giants are. And for as long as Tommy DeVito's there, you have to consider him, at the very least from a fantasy perspective. As Sheppy Sweetspot says, maybe he pulls a Geno or Baker comeback down the road. Who knows? Because it's a very interesting situation there in New York, and we're going to have to see how it all plays out. But that'll just about do it for today's edition of the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. I've been Christopher Shepard. Thank you all for tuning in. We'll be back here tomorrow at 3:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. As always, consider liking, following, and subscribing to the show during that time. It's a great way to contribute and interact with the show. But other than that, I am out till tomorrow. Have a great rest of your day.